before we really kind of dive into it and to really understand how sort of the country, the people, and the conflict have changed over the past 53 years, can you kind of give us a brief overview of 1967, of the Six-Day War? You know, a lot of people, you know, now understand the Six-Day War to be, you know, this great David and Goliath moment, you know, between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and certainly a war that Israel believed was going to take weeks, you know, really only lasted days, but was truly over in only hours. You know, can you kind of summarize the events of those 6 days and certainly where it's taken us since?
Sure. I mean, it's a big task, but I think before we get into the details, what's very important to understand is the perception, right? It's often very difficult not to indulge in what I call historical anachronism, looking at the world of 1967 through our own eyes. That's a lot of what happens, and we're going to get to some of the consequences of that as we go along. The reason I say this is because the question of who was David and who was the Goliath in 67 is kind of the crux question, and we're still facing it today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but one thing I can say is for sure is that Israel perceived itself under existential threat. I mean, what happened, what triggered the crisis was the decision by Egypt to remilitarize the Sinai, which had basically been demilitarized, functionally demilitarized, since 1956, since what was known as the Sinai Campaign. President Nasser of Egypt rolled tanks, 3 divisions into the Sinai in a surprise move, the details of which, if you want, you can listen to the podcast. For now, let's just say he did it. But the critical moment was the closing of the Straits of Tiran, which is Israel, the port of Eilat outlet to the Red Sea proper. If you come out of the Gulf of Eilat or Gulf of Aqaba, depending on what you call it, into the Red Sea, was Israel's gateway to Asia, Africa, and really much of the world. Critically, it was also where Iranian oil, such a strategic asset, came into Israel, and that closure was seen as casus belli. It was seen legally in Israel's eyes as a just cause for war. That happened on May 23rd, 1967, and in the subsequent 3 weeks, or what's known in Israeli history as Hahamtana, the waiting period, Israel was struggling internally to find the resolution to go to war, and also internationally. You know, one of the cardinal principles of Zionism, which I'm sure we'll touch on the consequences as well, was never to act without the backing of a major world power. And in this case, the United States was really the only candidate for that, and was saying very clearly, if Israel goes alone, then they will be alone. So they found themselves sort of hung by their philosophy of international politics and unable to act. As the pressure built and the rhetoric built, it's very important, of course, to note that whether one wants to see statements like, we will erase the shame of 1948, or we will drive the Jews into the sea, from the perspective of today, if you want to see that rhetoric as just sort of bombast and et cetera, in 1967, when a significant percentage of the country of Israel were Holocaust survivors, when their perception of what was to come was so disastrous that they were consecrating parks in Tel Aviv as graveyards, preparing for true elimination, that bombast actually played a critical role. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to June 5th, which is the night of June 4th is when the Israeli cabinet took a unanimous decision to make a preemptive strike on the Egyptian Air Force, what was known as Operation Moked, and in a truly miraculous series of events, eliminated the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, pivoted, struck the Syrian Air Force, did almost the same thing, and then in a series of events that we don't need to get into right now, both Jordan and Syria were drawn into the war, and over the next 6 days, Israel basically reshaped the map of the Middle East, recaptured the eastern half of the city of Jerusalem, including, of course, the Temple Mount and the Old City, which surrounds it, tripled the area of the country with the capture of the Sinai, the so-called West Bank, Yudan Shomron, and the Golan Heights, and more than anything else, really had a inner revolution, miyagun l'simcha, right? From this sense of mourning and fear to a sense of spaciousness and permanence. We live in a generation where we're very privileged that I have always had the state of Israel. My mother was born in 1948, so functionally my parents have always had the state of Israel. But it's important not to indulge again in that historical anachronism. The people who lived in Israel, particularly the leadership who had come from outside, who had fought the wars of independence, did not take for granted that what they had would be permanent. Mm-hmm. And in 1967 was the first breath of air which really hit both the leadership and the populace in saying, okay, we're here now to stay. This is real. that enough for a quick overview?
No, I think so. And, to add that, and I think this will be a good transition for where I want us to really kind of dive deep into how we arrived at that point is, not only you had mentioned, all the actions that Egypt had taken that were either, direct sort of encouragements of war or could easily be considered as, casus belli, as you mentioned before. But also, there were international guarantees given to Israel following the 1956 campaign that were violated by those international guarantors, notably the United States.
Yes, as well as Britain and France.
Yes.
They guaranteed free passage for Israel through the Straits of Tiran. That was the critical piece, as well as there was a UN emergency force that was stationed in both Gaza and down the coast of the Sinai Peninsula, which was ousted by Egypt in a move that Uthant, the then Secretary General of the United Nations, resisted not at all. He basically acquiesced on the basis of the fact that there was no legal binding contract for for Egypt to maintain foreign troops on its soil.
So keeping that in mind and what we've talked about, or certainly what you introduced, I think is very important. Sort of a foundational principle of Zionism of having international backing. For those of you who are familiar with Zionist history, and I don't mean sort of the G-rated fairy tale that's often talked about Israel's founding, but in terms of really understanding it as an ideology and certainly as a methodology, it did require the use of outside support, and not just as a bug, but also as a feature. You had Herzl going to the leaders of the Ottoman Empire, to the German Kaiser. Certainly his contemporaries and Weizmann and others, were obviously very cozy in London trying to get international support from major powers for Jewish national home in Palestine, what would eventually be the creation of the State of Israel. And that psychology, that mindset is very ingrained in sort of traditional Zionist thought. What is it about what you had described before and what I just kind of also offered? Why is that the case with Zionism? Where does that come from, and how did that lead to eventually 1967?
So, I mean, first things first, it's true for everyone, meaning international politics has always bowed to the reality of power. Even international law, I like to say international law is just a stick the strong use to beat the weak, meaning there's a way in which that is a reality, and the Zionists were eminently pragmatic, the political Zionists in particular, which is one of their great strengths in all honesty, and their ability to succeed where so many others had failed. So that's one piece. The other piece I think is a little bit both deeper, and is more indicative of the greater sweep of Jewish history, which is that Am Yisrael in exile lived with the understanding that the nations of the world create the context for history. Right? You mentioned my podcast. The podcast goes from the book of Daniel all the way through, where at this point we're in 1967, and I have no idea where I'm going to go to today, right? But I choose the book of Daniel because Daniel, in its heart, is about the transition from a internally referential context. The Bible is about Am Yisrael, God, the land of Israel, and we are the world, so to speak, right? And of course, there are other nations, et cetera, but God is the context, and we're the representatives. Just go with the narrative. I'm not asking you to buy the theology, right? Exile means accepting the fact that the nations of the world are now the context, both on a real politique element, but also from a perspective, from the divine perspective. God took kingship away from Israel and gave it to the nations. And so therefore, that need for international backing reflected a deep element of exile, which is that we are not the context. We're not attempting to create the great kingdom of Israel again. We're trying to create a safe space, as it were, for the Jews of the world to find refuge. And in many ways that led to 1967, because if you look at the transcripts, and they're available, many of them, of the cabinet discussions in 67, you see they're riddled with both fear, what the Soviet Union will do to us if we act, what the United States will do if we act without their approval, etc., and a self-perception of weakness, right? At the same time, a countercurrent of, if we can't act on our own, then we do not belong and will not survive here. There isn't particularly Yigal Allon, the sort of famous Palmach leader and later leader of Achdut Avodah, the sort of left-wing but territorially maximalist political faction. He was a very important influence in the discussions, as he was the one that kept hammering home, not from the perspective of God. God wasn't so present actually in those discussions, it's quite apparent, but rather from the perspective of what it means to be a people in its land, what it means to be sovereign, is to make your own decisions the context for how you're going to live. And 67 was the beginning of that transition. And the reality is, in my humble opinion, we didn't grasp that fully, and which is why we're in the situation that we're in today, which is we've avoided becoming sovereigns in the territory which we captured 53 years ago.
Mm-hmm. No, and very much to your point, as far as pragmatism, the way that, certainly a mutual friend of ours, Yehuda Cohen, I like the way he describes it, is very much, Zionism can be viewed sort of from two very much competing angles. One is that the Zionist or Zionism is about an object with a problem versus a subject with desires. And if you're operating from the perspective of the former, then any sort of pragmatism or any decisions you're engaging in, ultimately are about how do I scratch an itch? How do I alleviate what is just bothering me right now? And how do I remove myself from that situation? But if you don't know how you got into that situation, or certainly where you want to go out of that situation, how can you make really informed decisions? And to your point, I think that's where we've gotten stuck since 1967 as a result.
Yeah, the way I've had that discussion with Yehuda many times, and I'm indebted to him for that crystalline sort of layout of the challenge. The way I like to think of it is there's two elements within all of the Zionist movement. Early Zionism had, symptomatic of the Jews, an incredible diversity of thought. Everything from sort of messianic religious to sort of materialist Marxist and everything in between. But in each one of the particular strands, you can find two primary elements: the problem-solving element and the visionary element. And you can trace the decision-making and the successes and failures very clearly from which is ascendant. And the pragmatic element from 1948 to 1967 was dominant throughout Israeli society for good reasons, because you don't necessarily want the visionary dreamer solving the problems of mass immigration and the establishment of the economy and how do you reduce rampant inflation. You want the pragmatists. What happened in 67 is that there was an opening for a visionary leadership to step forward. And sadly, in many ways, it did not. But of course, the one place where the visionary element sort of popped out of the box was within religious Zionism. It's very interesting. If you look, religious Zionism up until 67 had more or less been an adjunct of the labor sort of center-left coalition. It was a very pragmatic approach. If you look in the transcripts, it was specifically Chaim Moshe Shapiro, who was the Minister for Religion in the government of the National Religious Party, who vehemently opposed war to the last, even opposed the recapture of Jerusalem, right? But what happens after 67 is the messianism, which was, of course, part of the fabric of religious Zionism, even then, basically burst forth, offering a vision in place of much of what the political, secular world was able to offer. Ultimately spun itself into what's known as the settlement movement today. It was known at the time as Gush Emunim, the Block of the Faithful, but that's perhaps too far to go. But it's important because I would say that we are where we are right now from a lack of vision.
And I think, and I think what's fair to really talk about that obviously transcends both political and ideological camps in Israel. That has been the case in Labor government, of Likud government. Even Menachem Begin, obviously signed a peace agreement with Egypt, returning the Sinai.
Which, by the way, was a visionary act.
Yeah.
Look at Begin, whether I agree or disagree, whether people think, if you look at how Begin spoke about it, is he had a vision of creating peace. And he pursued it from a pragmatic level. He might have been better off just saying, hey, we won the war. You want to go round three? Come on.
Yeah. So understanding, sorry, no, go ahead.
No.
So understanding how this all contributed to certainly the mindset of Zionist leadership, to the modern leadership of the state of Israel, and obviously its populace in particular, that first generation of Israelis, even before there really was, when much of the country was not even Sabra, a lot of them obviously were born outside the land.
Vast majority, sure.
Yes. What is it from 1967 to this day that even you've mentioned that Israel, there's now that opening for a visionary movement? Certainly the demographics of Israel have changed dramatically as it pertains both to the increasing population of religious Zionists, Haredim, even Arabs, certainly Mizrahi being the more dominant traditional culture. Where is it that all these, what you might call positive or at least advancement changes have occurred, is still holding us back to making that big, hard, difficult decision that is really kind of held us in place for 53 years?
I would say let's just dive in from the perspective of what the discussion that's happening today. Today, right now, the political echelon in Israel is wrapped up in this discussion of annexation, right? And you'll hear largely the right wing, although not entirely, pushing against the language of annexation and speaking about sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference in those two terms, I think, really communicates what's holding us back. Is that when you're a sovereign, we'll put it in reverse. When you annex, you take a piece of land. It's a pragmatic move. It's the motto of the pragmatic Zionists through the entire pre-state age was one more dunam, one more goat. Like, don't talk to me about what the state's going to look like, or what's the vision for government. Like, nah, we're going to punt. We're going to kick that one down the field for those of us who might not be football fans, right? And we're just going to focus on building, which, again, is not to be disparaged. But at a certain point, if you don't have a blueprint and a vision, what happens is that becomes an end unto itself, and even there's a disincentive to address the large issues. That's annexation. Give me this land. I mean, it's a shameful statement, in my humble opinion, to repeat, but Naftali Bennett last week, 2 weeks ago, said we want maximum land with the minimum number of Arabs. But aside from the somewhat sort of despicable dismissal of the human beings living there, I think it illuminates exactly the difference between annexation and sovereignty. See, because if you're going to annex, then the people who are not part of the Zionist dream yet, who live there, are simply a problem to be solved. If you're a sovereign, there's a responsibility to be met. And if you're going to meet that responsibility, you have to have some vision beyond Zionism, which was a normal people in its land, which is why Zionism was not equipped in its classic form to deal with the absorption of another, let's say, another populace, because at the time the numbers were different today. And even today, I don't want to quote a number because they'll kill me from the left, they'll kill me from the right. The numbers of how many Arab residents of Yudan and Shomron there are is sadly a hotly contested question. But do you hear what I'm saying? Is that in many ways the pragmatic element saw the acquisition of land as either a bargaining chip to be given away for peace, right? Or simply a reality that just can be held on to, and maybe we'll do, maybe we'll don't, which is why the settlement movement basically dragged the government by its nose. There was never any coherent government plan. To this day, there's no coherent government plan of how to develop Yudan Shomron.
Mm-hmm.
No,
I think the sad thing is also, even for those who wish to acquiesce it, who think we should give it back, or at least whether you want to say give it back, turn it over, nonetheless relinquish control for the purposes of advancing a blueprint or a framework. Even those who are adamant in that position to this day, what they're offering is certainly not something that the Palestinians, historically have been willing to accept or tolerate. In many ways, I can understand why, because it's not really an actual two-state solution. It's state minus or manipulation of occupation. It's effectively, how do we maximize Israel's benefits without compromising, let's change the status quo for Palestinians as long as it doesn't disrupt Israeli life the way it's currently going.
And how do we avoid taking responsibility for what's actually happening between the Jordan and the sea?
Mm-hmm.
That is my read. And by the way, that's true left and right. Because on the left, who says, us here, them there, let's build a wall, give them they don't care. I was on a panel recently with a person who's like a solid Meretz voter. If people aren't familiar, Meretz is one of the left-wing, I don't know if they identify themselves as Zionists anymore, but it's a classic left-wing element of Israeli government. And he basically said, I don't care what kind of government they have. I don't care if democracy, I don't care. It was the context was very specific. I said to him, how could you just wash your hands? First of all, your fellow human beings. Second of all, a situation which, no matter who you think is at fault, and we're certainly involved. You can't just simply that was a mess. America's suffering a lot from that, in the way in which slavery was sort of ended, and then that was a bad idea, and just walk away, as opposed to realizing that once you build a problem that deep into your society, there's a process of restoration and healing, which has to be actively engaged for as long, likely, as the wound was made. And so too, our destiny is together with the Arabs of this region as a whole, and certainly the ones that live within the classic land of Israel. In my humble opinion, we are destined to be sovereign here, but I see sovereignty as an expression of responsibility for every human being, every piece of land, every rock, every tree, responsibility, which doesn't mean you own it and it's yours, you get to do what you want. but rather you have to have some vision of what does it mean. Just think about it. What does it mean after 2,000 years that we are finally back in our land? And the heart and soul question is now, what is the role of a non-Jew within a Jewish society? A question which, since the time of King David, hasn't really, well, one could argue that the Hasmoneans, actually. So let's say since the time of the Hasmoneans hasn't been, but it is central, and lo and behold, look what's happening in the world. That's the central question. How do peoples of different narrative create a society together which actually forwards the destiny of humanity? Mm-hmm. That is not a coincidence.
No, and to go back to your point, as far as that story about sort of the merits representative that you spoke to, you know, given what we see going on in the world, whether it's within sovereign borders or amongst neighbors, how could you possibly imagine, just based on history, based on current events, and certainly even based on Israel's history with Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, how could you possibly imagine what happens to your neighbors is not going to impact you in some way? You're not going to be immune.
Well, but you understand, because your mission is actually fighting misinformation and ignorance, is that people are willfully ignorant. And in my experience, in addition to the work I do for the podcast and as a teacher, I'm a counselor. I do spiritual counseling, a lot of interpersonal work. And I'm telling you that the mind has no powerful ability than to deceive itself. We will construct willful lies to give us a sense of comfort, safety, and moral purity, often to our own detriment. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of that, and we do it out of fear and smallness of thinking. And there's a lot of fear and smallness of thinking, which is deeply welded into our psyche right now. Understandably, trust me, I'm Israel, Rachmanut, like it hasn't been an easy century, right? Nevertheless, on some level, tough luck. Like this is where we're at. We've been trying to have our cake and eat it too for 53 years, and it's only getting worse. And the fact that if I built a hut on my porch, the president of France would condemn me, says something about the situation we're in as a people right now. We should wake up and pay attention.
And it certainly says something about Am Yisrael. I mean, considering the fact that, you know, what we talked about before in terms of, you know, we talked about sort of the duality of Zionism, not only from those perspectives of, you know, object with the problem, subject with the desires, but you also inferred about sort of the dual nature of how that was sort of pragmatically or methodologically like executed, a very top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. That considering everything that was required to make, you know, the efforts of Zionism a reality, culminating with the state of Israel, whether that was reviving a dead language, ingathering exiles, you know, building, you know, infrastructure, institutions that could sustain that populace, all those things were beyond complex and, to my knowledge, have never been achieved, let alone, you know, succeeded anywhere else. We've done so much more difficult things in the past, yet it almost amazes me that things that I believe tend to be a little simpler, or at least are not as complex, we're struggling so much more to figure out and to really come to terms with.
Yeah, I'll tell you why I think why. Because we're at the crossroads where identity is the primary challenge, right? To build roads, create an economy, construct an army, it's no small thing. I mean, to go from being literally fuel of the ovens of Europe to a world-class military in the space of decades is nothing short of miraculous in my eyes. But nevertheless, it's a clear and present task. We're at the point where the question is no longer what do we need to do, but rather who are we, or who do we want to be? And one of the true tragedies of the last 100 years of our history is that the present layer of identity is welded to this conflict. I mean, the question I think a lot of people are unwilling to ask is, who would we be if we're over? You know, on the third day of the war, when the famous, you know, the entrance through the Lion's Gate and the taking of the Temple Mount by the Dana of the Temple Mount in our hands, right? There's a very good reason that the secular leadership and even the religious leadership backing them retreated very quickly from the Temple Mount. Right? It wasn't just that to them it was perhaps not so significant and etc. The Temple Mount puts that question of, who are you? Who do you want to be in the world? What is the purpose of having a state for the Jewish people in Israel? Puts those questions unavoidably in your face. Mm-hmm. And on one hand, identity is a life or death issue. People will fight tooth, nail, they'll go all the way to the mat for their identity. But on the other hand, it is the most frightening question that can be posed. And so therefore, it's much easier to say, well, no, don't worry about that. Build, don't think about it. And the reality is that particularly right now, the Arabs of this land, the region as a whole, but particularly the ones that live here, many of them for generations, not going to get into the whole historical debate, but that's undeniable in my humble opinion, right, are holding a mirror up to our faces. Israeli Arabs in particular, who on one hand are better off than any other segment of the Arab population in the Middle East in many socioeconomic factors, but on the other hand, have been told very clearly by our society, you don't really belong here. Not by all of our society, not in every way, but then they're just holding a mirror up to us saying, really, then who are you? Again, I'm open to what the answer is, but you have to hear the question. That I'm not open to. And I feel that so much of our society is just avoiding the question because that's a really hard thing to engage. That's how I see the present challenge, and therefore absorbing the territories, tripling in size, the euphoria, and don't undervalue the euphoria that struck in 1967. You know the story of the liberation of the city of Hebron? I'm betting you do.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So in brief, after Jerusalem was taken on the third day, it was obvious, even from a military standpoint, that Hebron needed to be taken next. Right? But Rav Shlomo Goren, who at the time was the chief rabbi of the army, after the famous picture of him blowing the shofar at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, leapt into a Jeep with nothing but a driver and raced down the road to Hebron, wildly blowing the shofar as he can, and the city fled before him. He literally conquered Hebron on his own with nothing but a driver and a shofar. The sense of the imminent revolution was in the air if you speak to anyone who lived at the time, and we deliberately retreated from it. What followed next in 1973, et cetera, that's a longer discussion. But that sense of euphoria was also a sense of the space given. And you know what happens when you've lived in narrow spaces and you come out into a wide place? You're struck by fear and uncertainty. What am I supposed to do right now? And therefore, we've been fumbling for 53 years, in my humble opinion.
So given that, and I think that's kind of part and parcel with the problem that, there are so many of our people who are very much looking backward instead of forward, where we talk about sort of the achievements of Zionism, how unique Zionism was, what Zionism accomplished, which is all true. But if you're trying to use, an outdated mode of transportation, an outdated and an obsolete vehicle that's meant to take you forward, you're obviously going to sputter your wheels. You're not going to move. You're going to get frustrated. And I think that's very much what we do communally. We're kind of wondering, why can't we still use the horse and buggy to get us somewhere when we know we're ready for the car?
Yeah, well, worse. Arnold Toynbee, great British philosopher, no great lover of the Jews, but nonetheless, that doesn't reduce his genius as a historian. He points out that, in short, yesterday's solutions become tomorrow's problems. In history, the minute you begin to worship the way in which you solve the problem, as opposed to the fact that you did, or what he calls when your creative minority, that small segment of your society, the Zionist movement, is able to awaken itself to the realities of the present need and act in unexpected ways to solve the problem presented by history and thus save and push your story forward. The minute that creative minority becomes a ruling minority, interested in protecting the movement or idea as opposed to engaging in the next problem in a fresh way, you've ceased to grow. And in many ways, your society is already dead. It may be a dead man walking. It can continue to thrive and flourish materially and even culturally. But the minute you worship your past instead of your future, it's done, right? And in many ways, if you look at the way Zionism is used as a stick to try to keep people in line within our political discourse today, you can see the symptoms of this. And that it really worries me. I'll tell you honestly, I see myself as a post-Zionist in the best of ways. I have a tremendous love, respect, all admiration. I live on a daily basis the benefits that Zionism achieved. And I think, like every good re-entry vehicle, right? It did its job, it did it well, and it should be put in its place in history, and we should think about what is next.
Yeah, I think that's also part of the problem when Zionism is too often used or is kind of exclusively thought within its ideology as opposed to within its methodology. Yes, there were ideas behind it, there were different streams that came through it, but at the end of the day, it was a platform, it was a set of verbs, it was action items, it was a means, like you said, an entry vehicle, means it served a functional purpose to go from—
It was phenomenally successful.
Yeah.
Credit where credit is due. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. I have absolute respect, despite in many ways how much I know about the story of Zionism, because it's not a simple story, which is obvious, because how could the returning of people to embodiment within its land after 2,000 years of exile be in any way simple? Furthermore, the world is a messy place, and all organic processes are complicated. So therefore, that is what it is. But we should have a tremendous pride, respect, and realism about the role Zionism has played in our history. It is not the end, it is the means.
Before we get into the Q&A, where I really want to hear from the audience in terms of what their thoughts are about what we've been discussing, as well as sort of what their thoughts are about the Six-Day War, certainly where we're going today, to kind of kickstart that conversation. And just as a reminder, audience, please use the Q&A, and we'd love to answer your questions to introduce them to this dialogue. I'm sure one thing that's very much on people's minds right now is all the recent conversations since the announcement of, Trump's deal of the century, that new sort of peace plan, certainly the way that the Israeli government is structured as a coalition that would actually allow Bibi Netanyahu's current government to begin annexing based on that map, or at least, using it as a basis for doing so. Can you kind of talk more about, sort of where you think we are in terms of that decision making going forward, and certainly what is sort of problematic about it, or what is potentially good about it as well, to offer the duality?
I think that the most important achievement is that President Trump and his administration have recognized the difference between giving away and giving back. That they recognize that whatever it is that Israel does not declare to be sovereign does not mean that it's not our land. It just means that for whatever reason, we're not going to assert our sovereignty over it. That's an important achievement because it's true. and therefore, any attempt to gain peace and reconciliation based on something other than truth, and there's more to the story than that, but I think is a mistake. The place where I see the problematics is the fact that it has opened the door once again for the sort of small-minded pragmatism of let's just get what we can here and take what we can there, and on one hand, with any real lack of concern for the couple million human beings, that aren't citizens and have been condemned to life under a Palestinian Authority, which is just rampantly corrupt and has not proven itself to be a true custodian of their rights and sort of meter of their needs. And it also shows, my good friend Yishai Fleischer put it so well the other day. He said, if you're sovereign, then you don't wait to declare your sovereignty contingent upon another power. No one can give you sovereignty. Sovereignty is something which you must assert. And last but not least, like I said, to me, the difference between annexation and sovereignty is the difference between treating the peoples who live in this land as a problem to be solved, as opposed to a responsibility to be met. Right? And I do not hear that latter, and it worries me very deeply. It worries me very deeply that we could end up in a situation where the challenges within our own society and our relationship to non-Jews in this land will push us toward treating large groups of people as a problem to be solved, which, as we know from history, never ends well.
No, I think that was very well said. Thank you. To kind of kick off our Q&A here, certainly, as I mentioned before, I want to hear from the audience in terms of what your opinions are, what you'd like us to talk about, certainly what you would want to address as it pertains to these issues. Start here at the top. How does the recent Israeli protests on West Bank annexation really reflect on the peace deal between the Israeli government and the PA?
You want me to answer that? The peace deal, I assume that what is being referred to there is the Oslo Accords. In my humble opinion, one needs to look honestly at the Oslo Accords. There was no peace deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis in the Oslo Accords. Israel created a de facto ruler in order to try to extricate itself from what the government of the time felt was a bad situation. The result was an oppressive government which has failed in its obligation toward its citizens. And we, on our side, have been more than willing to let them do so and feel morally justified then in acting without, there's no partner. So I think that the protests within Israeli society have nothing to do with that. They just have to do with the fact that there's a deep split within the Israeli consciousness over whether this portion of our land is something we want to assert our sovereignty over there, either because of the concern for the rights and well-being of the Arab peoples living there, or simply because we don't want it. We want to be a Jewish state. Remember, to the secular Israeli culture, the purpose of Zionism is what I call Brighton Beach Judaism. It's a Judaism where you're a Jew because everybody's a Jew. The bus driver's a Jew. The guy in the deli is a Jew. Your teacher's a Jew. Nobody has any substance or vision to what it means to be a Jew. We're all just Jewish. That is ruined, so to speak, by the presence of a large portion of non-Jews in your society. Whereas a visionary element, religious or not, but a visionary element has substance to its Judaism, and therefore it's not contingent upon sort of a pervasive majority. So that's my short take on that. It's a good question.
And actually, to your point, as far as protests or that type of disagreement about how such annexation or sovereignty plans would be going, I think one thing that some people are finding surprising, or certainly is, piquing their curiosity, is that within the Yesha Council, for those who aren't familiar, this is the organized movement of communities in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, formerly Gaza. They are not all on the same page as it pertains to not only this peace plan, certainly how Trump or Bibi wants to go about in terms of administering that annexation or that sovereignty. Can you talk a little bit about where sort of that stems from, or where you think that'll take us?
We've already identified the fracture line, which is it's between the pragmatists who say, take what you can get. This is the reality of world power. And we'll just keep inching our way forward. And the more visionary element who say, now is the time to be sovereign. Now, I find sadly that those who are speaking about being sovereign are not addressing in any substantive way the question of the sort of couple million human beings who currently live, and it pains me to say it, but in a situation which is unjust, right? And which is our responsibility. I didn't say fault. I said responsibility, right? And they're not speaking about it in a significant. One of the things I do, I run with a pretty right-wing crowd sometimes, and I have taken it upon myself to just keep pushing this point. And you'd be surprised, by the way, a lot of it is they simply haven't thought about it. There's a deeply self-referential particularism, which is in Am Yisrael in general, but in the settlement movement in particular. But once pushed to think about it, there are many creative thoughts that come out.
Mm-hmm. Without giving any sort of false comparison or analogy here, so I'm kind of preempting my words with that, is you've seen what's going on in the United States right now with obviously all the outrage surrounding the murder of George Floyd and everything else that's going on with protests. I think there's a huge segment of the American population that at one point was, while they were maybe aware of these injustices and these problems, it was the very fact that they didn't have to care about it because it wasn't impacting them, it wasn't right in front of them, that they never did. And I think the same can be said about a lot of these Israelis, in particular, those in the communities in the West Bank.
True, although you must add to that the 100-Year War.
Yeah.
Right? This is the place where comparisons really break down. Also, I don't think it's the tendency of America to reduce everything to race doesn't really map into our region. Nevertheless, the idea of structural violence, that our society has been built in a way in which to protect some while denying others, and that because it's structural, I don't have to walk out of my house and kick somebody in the face to get to my car, because functionally the playing field has been built so that I don't have to do that, but they're still getting that kick. I just don't have to see it. So that sense, there is truth. But the 100 Years War makes it very much more complicated, because there are deep-seated, very good reasons for the fear and mistrust and even hatred that are out there on both sides. And so it makes it, on one hand, more raw and therefore molten, available to change. On the other hand, much more personal.
To bring up our next question, we had brought up the topic of Jewish sovereignty in our historic lands. In terms of what's next, how can we achieve this, maintain a Jewish state of sorts, and also incorporate a whole other people who define themselves as Palestinian or non-Jews? Effectively, how does this not equal subjugation of another people? And I think, to kind of kick that off, or I'd like to see where you take this, I think that's very much the question that people are asking themselves when they're trying to figure out, should I support a two-state solution? Should I support a one-state solution? Should I support something that is neither of those two or something that is completely different? Because I think we are functioning under the paradigm that in order for the state that we all know, love, and obviously we want to do well and thrive, in order for that to be really Jewish, in order for it to be really democratic, that requires the Jewish democratic majority. And therefore, by upsetting that population balance, does that threaten that potential? And I think when people are operating under that scenario and that binary, that's when you have a lose-lose situation between the current proposed one-state paradigm and the current proposed two-state paradigm.
Yeah, first thing I would say, creativity. We need creative thought. This whole like one state, two state binary is not serving anyone. Number one. Number two, don't forget that democratic nation states are a product of the late 19th and early 20th century. They didn't exist before and they may not exist after. That's why I'm saying creative, stir the pot. And we don't have a tremendous amount of time. I don't want to give a whole discourse on this, but the other thing I would say is that, first of all, questions of citizenship and legal status are way more complex than talking about citizen, non-citizen. And that's the way what needs to happen, needs to look. We need to work toward building one society between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, right? While thinking about the fact that sovereignty functionally has three layers. Just give them to you briefly. There's territorial sovereignty, who has the, as Max Weber, the great sociologist says, who has the exclusive monopoly on the legitimate use of force to maintain order. That, oh, I just noticed my battery is about to die. You want to take that for 1 second before I lose us here? Sorry about that technical issue.
Sure. So yeah, I think that is a huge problem, that we are kind of stuck in this very rigid and shallow thinking when it comes to solutions. Certainly solutions that have been offered from the outside and not the inside. You know, as we were talking about before, Zionism was something incredibly creative. And even within that creativity, it was still based on a very sort of shallow and tried and true form of European nationalism that certainly was coming about in the 19th and 20th centuries. But there is a lot that we can take from certainly what has previously worked or has been previously tried, but not be restricted by it, not to be stuck within it. We can actually use these things to give us newer and fresher ideas to certainly to try out. I mean, what's the harm in trying? Everything else we've done so far has not gotten us anywhere positive.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize for my technical issue there. I'm glad I spotted it. If you mind if I give those three, because that'll be fuel for people to think about. First of all, territorial, in my humble opinion, everybody in the region wants Israel to have the power base here. Then there's economic sovereignty. Listen, in today's world, you have international corporations that have a greater economic sovereignty than many mid-sized nations. And so therefore, looking at the Palestinian people as a people who are economically sovereign, it's a very important question, whether it's in taxation, whether it's in sort of access to resource and decision-making, you know, whether it's, you know, et cetera, et cetera. The third piece is cultural sovereignty. And this is actually in many ways, I think, the most important and most difficult to define, because the late 19th, early 20th century of liberal democracy model was that nation equals nation state. It didn't begin that way, but it ultimately emerged. You know, if the Palestinian people have a desire to be a nation, that's why we speak about a state. Because in that logic, if there's no state, you're not really a nation. Think about it. The world body is called what? The United Nations, right? And therefore, ipso facto, if you're not part of that, you're not a nation. You're not a nation. You're not part of that. We need to start thinking about what peoplehood is and who, in history, has had more to say about what it means to be a people than Am Yisrael. This is all premised, though, on desire of Am Yisrael. I'm not interested in this whole discourse of we don't have a partner. I don't care if we have a partner or not. We have a responsibility. That's it. Seek, right? Right. It's all premised on the idea that we need to look at the situation not as a problem to be solved, but as a responsibility to be taken up. Right? And then we could talk about international citizenship, resident alien, national minorities, you know, federation. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that can be discussed, but it'll only work if we, on one hand, are confident in our status as sovereign, and on the other hand, take that as a deep sense of responsibility for all peoples living here.
Yeah, and you know, you were making me think of something else. I think one of the issues within this conflict that most people don't consider is that, you know, it's sort of presumed that the way Israelis think about the conflict is the same way that Palestinians think about the conflict, or the same way Palestinians think about the conflict, or the way that Israelis do. That,
aside from the fact that neither are monolithic.
Exactly, that our aspirations and our grievances must be identical to theirs. And when we're superimposing those identities, that mindset, we're fighting our fantasy of who the other is as opposed to who they actually are or what they really say about themselves. And I think that's also led to real problems. And that's not an Israeli problem. Palestinians do that plenty on their own without us.
It's a human problem because we build identities largely around the identity we assign to our other. That's a little bit abstract statement, but it's worth thinking about it, right? The negative side of identity is very common. And if you think about what white identity and black identity in America have become, et cetera, it's a major challenge. I would add one more thing as an educator, a plug. We need a deeper, richer, and more revolutionary Judaism, right? One of the shortcomings you're seeing is the relative shallowness of secular Israeli culture as Jews. If you talk about a Jewish and democratic state, are they talking about something which is substantively Jewish or functionally Jewish? Meaning, is it that it's Jewish because we're all Jews, the Brighton Beach model, or is it a Jewish state because being a Jew means something, whatever it means? I'm not getting into that right now. It's an important discourse. Do you hear the difference? Because if we're substantively Jewish, well then, we can actually withstand and even perhaps thrive from a deep engagement with an other culture within our society.
I mean, you could also say that about democracy, substantive versus functional. For
sure. Democracy is moving away from the values-based 19th century liberalism toward a procedural approach for also good reasons in terms of the diversity of the populace that it represents. I'll give you an example. I've asked this question to a number of my more right-wing friends, and I'm always astounded. I said, and we're talking about religious right-wing Zionists. I said, if you could choose, you were allowed to, somehow, on one side of the choice, you could have the Temple Mount back and we would begin rebuilding the temple. But the price, so to speak, you pay is you have to give citizenship to every person between the Mediterranean and the Jordans. Which would you choose? And almost universally, with one very notable and beloved exception, the answer is I wouldn't take that. Can't do that for this reason, that reason. Meaning the national religious stance is in danger of becoming a national stance and losing the visionary substance that the religion has always added. Torah needs to take a very different face in our world today, and that's going to take a lot of work.
To kind of introduce our last question, I'd like to use this I think this is a really good question, and certainly allows us to kind of leave some food for thought as when everyone reflects on this once they've left this room, but also with current events or soon to be current events that are inevitable to come up. We have a question that says, is there anything Israel could have done during the Six-Day War to avoid the current scenario of sovereignty and attaining peace? And I'd like to add to that question to also, based on what Israel could have done then, what can Israel do now?
So one thing that has to be stated is that, Benny Morris, you familiar with Benny Morris?
Sure.
The sort of
Alter Rebbe of the new on my shelf back here.
There you go. The Alter Rebbe of the new historians. He gave an interview to Haaretz during the Second Intifada. Right? This is a man who refused his service and went to jail because he didn't want to serve in Yudan Shomron, etc. And he gave an interview where he said that Israel's great mistake in 1948 and 1967 was not actually emptying the country of all of its Arab residents. And you can imagine that Haaretz was a little shocked, And the interviewer said, aren't you advocating ethnic cleansing? And what he said was, well, if I had to choose between genocide and ethnic cleansing, I will take the latter. Right? And his point was that at this point of existential struggle, and I'm not advocating, please don't misunderstand me, because we're not there anymore. It's precisely my point, actually, is that one thing Israel could have done was fought the war to the finish. And we did not. Nor did we maintain our sovereignty over the Temple Mount, which, whatever your religious sentiments may be, would have been a very important visionary message to the world about who we were and what we were trying to accomplish, right? The other thing that Israel could have done at the time was to recognize the reality of the Arab populace. It may sound strange, but one of the dominant themes within many strains of Zionism was an incredible blindness to the reality of other people, and even eventually another people, meaning as opposed to individuals, an actual national consciousness emerging within our land. And just a willful ignoring. So if there had not been that willful ignoring, I think many things could have been different. So then, which rolls on to the second half of your question, which is what is it we can do? We need to begin to work with our own identity and that of the Arabs within this land to figure out how we can build one society where we don't have a sense of scarcity of identity in order for me to be me. You can't exist, which is the current discourse between Israelis and Palestinians, right? To be a Palestinian means that Israel is the Nakba, it's a disaster, and it's a land theft, etc. There was this country of Palestine that we swooped down out of Europe and snatched up out of the converse amongst the Israelis is there are no Palestinians. They don't exist. They're fake. I mean, sorry. I mean, I could find you a couple million people who would disagree. Which again, with everyone getting into the historical realities, on some level that doesn't matter. You have a group of people who have an identity. You must relate to that as a reality. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to side with it, but you can't pretend it doesn't exist. So I think the first step, as sad as it sounds, is a simple recognition of the deep existence of other, and by the way, a commitment that all the fantasies, explicit or implicit, that the other is going to disappear will be let go of. And that's a place where Israel has actually progressed. I remember when I first made Aliyah 18 years ago, transfer of the Arab residents between the Mediterranean and the Jordan was still a live political issue. Rav Ben Elon's party, Moledet, was in the Knesset, was a part of the government at one point, with the known plan of transfer. That element of the political spectrum has basically fallen off the map. And right wing, left wing, that's not my issue. The point is that ridiculous fantasy that the other is just going to disappear if I wish hard enough, which wastes energy and distracts from the real solutions, God willing, is gone. In which case now, once you say the other is real and exists, what's justice look like? What's the society look like? I'm a Jewish nationalist, as has probably become clear in our conversation. So I'm interested in being the sole sovereign here. But what's it mean to be a sovereign? Doesn't mean that other human beings are a problem to be solved. It means that they're a responsibility to be met. And that's the piece that we fumbled in 1967. And that's the piece that we are now being called upon to engage today.